It started with a white envelope taped neatly to the front door, the HOA logo stamped in the top corner like an official seal of judgment. The day was warm, the sun was just beginning its slow slide toward the horizon, and the air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass. It should have been a perfect afternoon. But that envelope, small, unassuming, carried the kind of weight that could sour even the brightest day. For months, the backyard had been a personal sanctuary, a place of quiet retreat after long days of work, where birds chirped from the neighboring maple trees and the faint hum of distant lawnmowers served as background noise. The shed had been the crown jewel of that space. A simple, sturdy structure, painted a warm cedar brown, with a pitched roof that matched the style of the house. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't out of place. But it had been built without the HOA's pre-approval. And in their eyes, that was enough to turn it into a violation. The letter spelled it out in sterile, legal phrasing. Non-compliant accessory structure was the term they used. It must be removed, relocated, or brought into compliance within 14 days. Failure to comply would result in fines, $500 per day, until the violation was resolved. The HOA board wasn't new to this sort of thing. They thrived on control, feeding off technicalities buried deep in a handbook most residents never bothered to read. Their members, retirees with too much time, self-appointed guardians of neighborhood standards, prided themselves on catching even the smallest deviations. A flower bed in the wrong shade of mulch, a fence 1 inch too high, holiday decorations still hanging in mid-January. The shed, they decided, was an eyesore. It wasn't an eyesore. Neighbors walking by often complimented it. It was well-built, painted tastefully, and tucked neatly into the back corner of the yard. But the HOA didn't care about aesthetics. This was about control, and once they set their sights on something, they rarely backed down. The days after the letter arrived were filled with unease. Every walk to the mailbox carried the dread of another notice, another warning, another reminder of the fines ticking closer. The board had a way of making their targets feel cornered, as if every move was being watched. And in a way it was. Their so-called compliance committee made regular rounds through the neighborhood, clipboards in hand, snapping discreet photos from the sidewalk. By the end of the first week, the frustration began to boil. The shed wasn't hurting anyone. It wasn't lowering property values. It was built entirely on private land, far from any property lines. And yet, the HOA had decided to make it their personal crusade. The more they pushed, the more it became clear they weren't just enforcing rules. They were flexing power, testing limits. On the 8th day, a second letter arrived, this one marked final warning in bold, red font. The wording was more aggressive now, hinting at legal action and escalating penalties. It was almost impressive how quickly they escalated things. For a group of volunteers, they moved with the efficiency of a corporate legal department. That night, the search for answers began. Not just in the HOA handbook, but in local property ordinances, zoning regulations, and building codes. The HOA had their rules, but they weren't the law. And sometimes those rules had cracks, small, overlooked details that could turn an open and shut case into a dead end. It was during one of these late-night searches that the loophole appeared. A paragraph buried deep in the HOA's own covenant documents, written in the dry language of legal contracts, stated that the association had authority over permanent structures built within visible areas of the property. But another clause, seemingly unrelated, excluded temporary, non-fixed structures from their jurisdiction, as long as they met certain safety and zoning requirements. The shed, as it stood, was bolted into a concrete foundation. That made it permanent in the eyes of the HOA. But what if it wasn't? What if it was technically a temporary structure? If the foundation was removed, and the shed was placed on skids instead of footings, it would qualify under the exemption. It wouldn't matter if it sat in the exact same spot, looked exactly the same, or served the exact same purpose. On paper, it would no longer be something the HOA could touch. The realization was electric. The rules they were using as a weapon could be turned back on them, and not just to escape fines but to make a point. It wouldn't be enough to simply remove the shed and quietly rebuild it. No, this would be done in plain sight for the whole neighborhood to see. The board's smug certainty would be dismantled piece by piece, just like the bolts in the shed's foundation. The decision was made. The next morning would mark the first step in a plan that would frustrate the HOA to their core. It wouldn't be quick and it wouldn't be quiet. But when it was over, they would know exactly what it felt like to lose control, and they wouldn't be able to do a thing about it. The letter still sat on the kitchen counter, its corners curling slightly from being handled so many times. It no longer looked like a threat. Now it was a challenge. One that would be met with patience, precision, and just the right amount of petty satisfaction. The sun had long since set, and the neighborhood was quiet except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Somewhere, a board member was probably feeling quite pleased with themselves, believing that their warning had backed another homeowner into a corner. But they were wrong. This wasn't a corner. This was the starting line. Tomorrow, the real game would begin. The morning sun broke over the rooftops, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. From the outside, it looked like any other Saturday. Lawns glistened with dew, sprinklers ticked rhythmically, and the distant hum of a leaf blower carried from a few houses away. But in one backyard, things were about to shift from routine to something far more calculated. The shed stood exactly where it always had, neat, well-kept, and stubbornly in place despite the HOA's threats. But its days as a permanent structure were numbered. The plan was clear: dismantle just enough of it to alter its classification without changing its appearance. It wasn't destruction. It was transformation, the kind that would exist in the gray space between the HOA's authority and the actual law. The first step was to sever its ties to the ground. The shed's floor was bolted into a poured concrete pad, a sturdy, unmovable base that made it undeniably permanent in the board's eyes. That had to change. The bolts came out one by one, their metallic groans blending with the morning sounds of the neighborhood. Each removed anchor wasn't just a piece of hardware freed from the earth. It was a thread pulled from the HOA's grip. By midday, the shed's base was no longer fixed. The concrete slab would remain. There was no rule against the slab itself, but the shed would be moved onto heavy-duty skids. These skids, wide beams designed to support weight while allowing mobility, would make the shed temporary, under the covenant's own language. Could now, technically, be relocated at any time. And that technicality was everything. Neighbors began to notice. A few slowed their walks to glance into the backyard, curiosity piqued by the unusual activity. No one asked questions, at least not directly, but the subtle exchange of knowing looks hinted that word would spread. In neighborhoods governed by an HOA, news traveled quickly, often arriving at the board before the truth had even formed. The work was meticulous. Every action had to be measured, every change deliberate. The structure's appearance couldn't give away what was happening, or the board would move to adapt their tactics. From the sidewalk, it would look exactly the same as it had for months. Only the foundation, invisible to passersby, would tell a different story. By late afternoon, the skids were in place, and the shed rested solidly upon them. It hadn't moved an inch, but in legal terms, it might as well have been on wheels. The transformation was invisible to the untrained eye, but in the world of HOA politics, it was monumental. The shed was now untouchable by the very rules they had weaponized. That night, the official notice from the HOA sat on the kitchen counter again, but this time it was accompanied by a printed copy of the covenant's own language, highlighted and underlined in key places. The clause about permanent structures, the exemption for temporary, non-fixed structures, the definitions that the board had likely assumed no one would ever challenge. They had written their own trap years ago, and now it had been turned back on them. 2 days later, the expected happened. A board member, one of the more notorious enforcers, appeared on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand. They lingered near the fence line, peering into the backyard, scanning the shed for changes. From their angle, nothing seemed different. No alterations to the siding, no fresh paint, no visible work. They scribbled notes and walked away, but not without a final glance that carried the weight of unspoken suspicion. The following morning, the letter arrived. It was not a fine, but an observation of continued noncompliance. It reiterated the demand for removal or modification but made no mention of the foundation. That absence was telling. They didn't know, at least not yet, what had been done. This was where patience mattered. The temptation to respond immediately with proof of compliance was strong, but revealing the hand too early would rob the moment of its impact. The plan wasn't just to avoid the fine. The plan was to let the HOA push as far as they could, to let them believe they were closing in, and then, at the peak of their certainty, reveal the loophole in a way that would leave them with nothing to strike back against. The days passed with an almost electric tension. The board's visits became more frequent, their notes more aggressive. A few other residents began whispering about the shed issue, curious about how it would end. The HOA had a reputation for always winning, for wearing down opposition with a combination of bureaucracy and persistence. No one could remember the last time someone had stood up to them and actually walked away victorious. It became clear that the board was preparing to escalate. There were whispers about legal action, about bringing in an outside inspector, about presenting the case at the next community meeting. They wanted a show of force. They wanted to make an example. And that was perfect. The bigger the stage they built, the louder the humiliation would be when it all collapsed. The next chapter in this game wasn't about construction anymore. It was about timing. The work had been done. The shed was legally safe. Now it was about waiting, letting the HOA dig their own hole deeper and deeper until they were the ones who couldn't climb out. The trap was set, and soon the board was going to walk right into it. The notice for the next HOA community meeting appeared on every doorstep a week in advance, tucked neatly into mailboxes and slipped under doormats. The announcement was written in the same crisp, official language as all HOA communications, concise, impersonal, and authoritative. But one line stood out, buried in the list of agenda items: review of ongoing property compliance violations. It wasn't hard to guess what that meant. The shed had now moved from a private irritation for the board to a public performance. They wanted eyes on it. They wanted an audience for what they assumed would be their victory. This was the moment they had been circling toward since the first letter. The meeting was their stage, and they intended to make the most of it. The days leading up to it were almost eerily quiet. The usual patrols slowed, the daily sidelong glances from board members became less frequent, and the mailbox remained free of fresh notices. It was as if they were storing their energy for the spectacle to come. But beneath that silence, tension hummed like an electrical current. The shed stood untouched, sitting in its corner of the backyard with the quiet confidence of someone holding a winning hand. When the evening of the meeting arrived, the community hall was already half full by the time the doors opened. The HOA board members sat at the front behind a long folding table, papers stacked neatly before them, their name tags gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Around the room, rows of folding chairs creaked under the weight of curious neighbors who had come for the usual updates about landscaping budgets and seasonal decoration guidelines. But more than a few were there for the shed drama. The meeting began with routine matters: budget approvals, maintenance updates, and a drawn-out discussion about whether the community should invest in new holiday lighting for the front gate. But as the agenda inched forward, anticipation built. Eventually, the board president cleared their throat, leaned into the microphone, and announced that they were moving on to a matter of ongoing noncompliance. They spoke with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was inevitable. They described the unauthorized structure in formal, almost theatrical terms, outlining the original violation, the fines that had been threatened, and the refusal to bring the property into compliance. They hinted at the board's patience running thin and the potential for further legal measures. It was all carefully framed, a story in which the board was the hero, defending the neighborhood's standards against a rogue homeowner. But beneath the polished delivery, there was a hint of irritation, a faint strain in their voice. They had expected resistance to crumble by now. Instead, it had held firm. When the floor was opened for comments, a few residents spoke up. Some sided with the board, expressing concern about precedent and uniformity. Others, though, asked pointed questions about why the shed was such an urgent matter when other, more obvious eyesores in the neighborhood seemed to go unchecked. Those questions were deflected with the usual vague assurances about process and fairness. Then came the moment that had been quietly prepared for. When asked if there was anything to add in defense of the shed, the response was calm and precise. There was no emotional outburst, no angry retort, just the simple, documented fact that the structure in question was no longer permanent. The concrete anchors had been removed. The shed was now set on movable skids, fully qualifying under the covenant's exemption for temporary, non-fixed structures. The reaction from the board was almost imperceptible at first. A pause, a tightening of jaws, a subtle exchange of glances between members. They knew exactly what this meant. The rule they had been enforcing no longer applied. Their case had collapsed in on itself. But the moment was far from over. A printed copy of the covenant's own language was produced, the relevant sections highlighted in bright yellow. It was passed forward to the board, and as they skimmed it, the tension in the room shifted. Murmurs rippled through the audience. People leaned toward their neighbors, whispering and raising eyebrows. The board tried to recover, suggesting that they would review the situation and consult with counsel. But the damage was done. The residents had seen it happen. The board, usually so sure of themselves, suddenly thrown off balance by their own rules. Their show of authority had been interrupted by something they couldn't immediately dismiss, the truth written in their own hand. The rest of the meeting dragged on, but the energy had changed. The other agenda items felt like an afterthought. The shed had stolen the spotlight, and for the first time in a long while, the board didn't seem untouchable. Walking out into the cool night air afterward, there was a strange new atmosphere in the neighborhood. It wasn't outright celebration, but there was a quiet undercurrent of satisfaction among those who had watched the exchange. The story would spread quickly, and it would grow with each retelling. The HOA had wanted this to be the moment they broke the homeowner's resolve. Instead, it had become the moment they lost control of the narrative. But the game wasn't finished yet. If anything, this was just the beginning of the fun. The loophole had worked, but now it was time to make sure they couldn't touch the shed, or anything else, ever again. And the best way to do that was to push the rules as far as they could possibly go. The days after the HOA meeting were unlike anything the neighborhood had seen in a long time. It wasn't chaos, but there was a subtle electricity in the air, as though the balance of power had shifted, even if just slightly. Word spread quickly, carried on the invisible threads of neighborhood gossip, whispered over backyard fences and murmured in hushed tones during evening walks. The shed, once just a simple backyard structure, had now become a quiet symbol of defiance, proof that the board's authority wasn't absolute. But symbols alone weren't enough. A quiet victory could be satisfying in the moment, but a lasting one required something more. It required visibility. The HOA thrived on controlling what people could see. The perfect lawns, the uniform mailboxes, the identical shade of paint on every home. If the shed had already slipped through their grasp, then the next move would be to make it impossible for them to ignore, all while staying firmly within the limits of the rules they themselves had written. The first change was subtle. A fresh coat of paint, still within the approved palette of course, gave the shed a sharper, newer appearance. It gleamed in the sunlight, drawing the eye without ever stepping out of compliance. Then came the landscaping. Small, tasteful garden beds were installed around the perimeter, filled with perennials and native plants, all of them on the HOA's own approved flora list. They were arranged with meticulous care, giving the shed the appearance of being the centerpiece of a deliberate, well-maintained outdoor space. From the street, it was now impossible to miss. Passers-by paused to admire it. Neighbors walking their dogs slowed as they went by, taking in the transformation. Some nodded with quiet approval. Others smirked knowingly, aware of the ongoing battle. Every glance, every comment was another reminder to the HOA that the structure they had tried so hard to erase was now more prominent than ever, and there was nothing they could say about it. But that was only the beginning. The next move was bolder. The shed's function expanded. Small, weather-resistant shelves were installed on one side, holding potted herbs and flowers. A portable rain barrel was placed nearby, catching runoff from the roof, both fully compliant with local ordinances and the HOA's own environmental guidelines. These changes weren't just cosmetic. They made the shed a working part of the property's ecosystem, an example of eco-friendly enhancement that the board had often praised in their newsletters. The effect on the HOA was almost palpable. Their patrols increased again, the clipboards reappearing, and the subtle surveillance resumed. But now, their visits had a different energy, one of frustration, not authority. They couldn't point to a single violation, yet their inability to control the situation seemed to eat at them. Every time they passed by, the shed stood there like a quiet challenge, surrounded by improvements they couldn't possibly object to. Still, the plan wasn't to simply win. The plan was to make the win unforgettable. And for that, there had to be an event, something that would etch the shed into the collective memory of the neighborhood. The opportunity came with the annual Community Garden Day, a casual weekend where residents were encouraged to work on their yards, share tips, and showcase improvements. The HOA usually used the event to highlight model properties, holding them up as examples of what the neighborhood should aspire to be. The shed was entered as a feature, not just as a structure, but as part of a backyard oasis demonstration. Photos were taken, flyers were printed, and on the day of the event, neighbors were invited to step into the yard, walk around the garden beds, and admire the craftsmanship of the shed itself. The irony was almost too perfect. An event designed to promote the HOA's vision of community aesthetics now served as a stage for the very thing they had tried to eliminate. All day, people came and went. Compliments flowed. The shed's temporary status was invisible to most visitors, but the knowledge of it simmered just beneath the surface for those who had been following the dispute. The board members who attended avoided lingering near it for long, their smiles tight and forced, their conversations short. They knew they couldn't say a word without admitting defeat. By the end of the weekend, the shed wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. Photos from the event made their way onto the community's social media pages, racking up likes and positive comments. The HOA's own newsletter, obligated to report on the success of Garden Day, included a wide shot of the yard with the shed squarely in the background. The victory was now immortalized in their own official publication. For the homeowner, it was more than just personal satisfaction. It was a strategic message. The rules could be followed to the letter and still used as a shield against overreach. And once that lesson spread through the neighborhood, the board's grip would loosen. People would begin to question, to read the covenants more closely, to realize that the HOA's authority wasn't as absolute as they wanted it to seem. The board knew it too. Their silence in the weeks after the event wasn't acceptance. It was calculation. They were regrouping, looking for a new angle, a fresh approach to reclaim control. They wouldn't stay quiet forever, and that was fine, because the next move was already being planned. If they wanted a fight, they would get one. But this time, it wouldn't be about defending a single shed. It would be about reshaping the entire balance of power in the neighborhood. The shed had been the opening act. The real show was still to come. For a short while after the Community Garden Day, the air in the neighborhood felt unusually calm. The shed stood untouched, its fresh paint and neat landscaping serving as a quiet monument to the victory. Neighbors passed by with small nods and knowing smiles, their glances carrying the silent acknowledgement that the battle had been won, at least for now. Even the board seemed to have retreated into the background, their patrols less frequent, their newsletters bland and uneventful. But it was only the calm before the storm. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a certified envelope, hand-delivered and marked with the HOA's letterhead. It was thicker than the previous notices, heavy with paperwork. Inside, the tone had shifted. There was no direct mention of the shed anymore. Perhaps they had finally realized they couldn't win that fight. Instead, the board had taken a new angle, a comprehensive property compliance audit. This audit was framed as a routine inspection of the entire property to ensure that it met all current community standards. The language was polished and polite, but the intent was unmistakable. If they couldn't remove the shed, they would find something else, anything else, to use as leverage. Over the next week, the familiar figures of board members reappeared, walking slowly past the property, clipboards in hand, eyes scanning every inch. They weren't subtle about it. They peered over fences, lingered at the edges of the lawn, and even stood at the sidewalk with cameras, zooming in on details that no one else would notice. A single weed poking through the driveway cracks, a hairline chip in the trim paint, a recycling bin placed a few inches outside the designated storage area. Every minor imperfection was noted. Soon, the letters began arriving. Each one was a neatly typed list of violations, each one more absurd than the last. The flower bed was encroaching on the HOA-mandated setback zone. The rain barrel was inconsistent with aesthetic guidelines. Even the color of the mulch was suddenly deemed non-compliant. Despite being the exact same shade that had been approved years earlier, it was a scattershot approach, overwhelming in volume rather than substance. The board's strategy was clear. If they couldn't win on the shed, they would drown the homeowner in enough petty grievances to force compliance through exhaustion. Most people in the neighborhood, faced with such relentless pressure, would give in long before things escalated further. But this wasn't most people. Every letter was read, dissected, and answered with precision. The HOA's own covenants and local ordinances were referenced in detail. Each accusation met with documentation that disproved it. Photographs were taken, timestamps logged, and copies of past approvals dug out of old files. Each rebuttal was sent back with polite, methodical certainty, leaving no room for the board to twist the facts. And as the responses piled up, something unexpected began to happen. The neighbors started to notice the pattern. They saw the board's constant presence, their endless nitpicking, their thinly veiled attempts to find fault where none existed. Some began asking quiet questions. Others started reviewing their own properties, worried they might be next in the board's crosshairs. The more the HOA pushed, the more their actions seemed less like protecting community standards and more like harassment. And that was when the tide truly began to turn. With every absurd violation dismissed, the homeowner's credibility grew while the board's image slowly eroded. The neighborhood Facebook group began buzzing with discussions. Residents swapped stories about their own run-ins with the HOA, sharing tips on how to read the covenants, how to challenge baseless claims, and how to document interactions. The quiet rebellion was spreading. The board, sensing their grip slipping, tried one last maneuver. They issued an official summons to a mandatory compliance hearing, to be held in the community hall. The notice was formal, bordering on intimidating, with a list of alleged violations that now included vague accusations like failure to maintain harmonious community appearance. A phrase so broad it could mean anything. The stage was set once again. But this time, the shed wasn't the centerpiece. This was bigger. A confrontation about the HOA's behavior itself. One that would unfold not just in front of the board, but in front of an audience of neighbors who had been quietly watching everything. The homeowner prepared carefully, organizing every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence into a tidy, undeniable record. The shed's loophole had been the first blow, but this hearing could be the one that broke the board's campaign entirely. When the evening arrived, the community hall was packed. Even residents with no direct stake in the matter had come, curiosity pulling them in. The board sat stiffly at the front, the president's gavel resting on the table like a weapon waiting to be used. The atmosphere was heavy, the kind of tense stillness that comes before a storm. This wasn't just about one property anymore. It was about power, who had it, and how it was used. And by the end of the night, that power was going to shift. The night of the compliance hearing was one of those evenings where the air felt charged before anything even began. The community hall's lights burned harshly against the dim parking lot outside, drawing residents in like moths to a flame. Cars lined both sides of the street, far more than what was typical for any HOA meeting. Word had spread not through official channels, of course, but through whispers, text chains, and the increasingly active neighborhood Facebook group. Inside, the folding chairs were arranged in neat, utilitarian rows, but they filled quickly. Neighbors who rarely bothered with board meetings now sat shoulder to shoulder, many holding notebooks, phones, or just crossed arms that seemed ready for whatever spectacle might unfold. The HOA board sat at their long table up front, a solid wall of rigid posture and tight-lipped expressions. At the center, The president kept one hand on the gavel like a reflex, as though she might need to pound it at any moment to restore order. The accusations against the homeowner were read first, one after another, in an almost ceremonial tone. There was no mention of the shed anymore. That battle had been quietly conceded, but instead, a laundry list of grievances that ranged from the painfully petty to the outright absurd. The placement of the rain barrel, the type of birdseed in the feeder, the visual discord caused by the choice of seasonal wreath, the excessive presence of solar lights along the walkway. Each complaint was presented as though it carried the weight of law, yet beneath the surface, there was something desperate about it. The board wasn't trying to preserve community standards anymore. They were trying to reassert dominance. Then came the rebuttal. The homeowner stood calmly, a stack of binders and folders laid neatly on the table before them. Every alleged violation was addressed in turn. For each, there was a reference to the HOA's own covenants, often highlighting vague wording or outright contradictions that made the accusation meaningless. Where the rules did have clarity, there were dated approvals from past years, sometimes even signed off by members of the very same board, proving that the so-called violations were fully compliant. Photographs were displayed one by one, each carefully time-stamped. In one instance, the encroaching flower bed was shown alongside the original landscaping map, which proved it hadn't moved an inch in over a decade. The supposed non-compliant mulch color was demonstrated to be the exact shade on the HOA's own approved materials list. The visual discord of the wreath was countered with archival photos of past holiday seasons showing other homes, including board members, with decorations far more garish. It wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a dismantling. As the evidence mounted, murmurs began to ripple through the crowd. The board's stiff expressions faltered, their eyes darting between one another as though searching for some last-minute strategy to salvage the situation. But it was too late. The neighbors had seen enough. The flimsy accusations, the obvious targeting, the sheer waste of time and resources. It was all laid bare under the unflinching light of documentation. When the presentation ended, the room hung in a moment of silence that felt heavier than any shouting could have. The board retreated briefly into a closed session, leaving the residents to their own quiet discussions. And when they returned, their verdict was delivered with clipped efficiency. All alleged violations dismissed, case closed. But the real victory didn't come from the decision itself. It came from the aftermath. Within days, several neighbors began openly discussing changes to the board's structure. Petitions circulated to introduce term limits, transparency requirements, and new rules preventing board members from issuing citations without photographic evidence and majority approval. Some residents even announced their intention to run for board positions in the next election cycle. The once untouchable HOA leadership had been cracked wide open. The shed, that original, non-compliant structure that had sparked this entire ordeal, remained exactly where it was, pristine and unbothered. But now it stood for something more. It was no longer just a clever loophole or an act of defiance. It had become a quiet landmark in the neighborhood, a reminder that rules could be challenged, that pettiness could be beaten, and that sometimes the best revenge was to expose the absurdity for everyone to see. The board members who had spearheaded the fight began to fade from prominence. Their patrols grew less frequent, their newsletters more generic, their presence at community events half-hearted at best. A few even resigned before their terms ended, citing personal reasons. Life in the neighborhood settled into something more peaceful. There were still rules, of course, but enforcement became less about flexing authority and more about actual community upkeep. The tension that had hung over every front yard slowly dissipated, replaced by a cautious optimism. The homeowner never made a big show of their victory. The shed remained neatly painted, the garden around it well kept. But every now and then, a neighbor passing by would give a small nod, a knowing smile, or a quiet thumbs up. It was their way of acknowledging what had happened, the ridiculousness endured, the persistence required, and the satisfaction of seeing a petty power play collapse under its own weight. And somewhere in the back of everyone's mind, the legend of the $500 a day fines that never materialized lived on. It was retold at backyard barbecues, whispered over fences, and eventually shared in online threads far beyond the subdivision. The story spread, not because of the shed itself, but because of what it represented. The moment someone refused to be bullied into compliance, found the one gap in the armor, and turned it into a shield the board couldn't touch. In the end, the HOA had tried to find the wrong person. They had underestimated the power of persistence, preparation, and just the right amount of petty revenge. And for years afterward, anyone new who moved into the neighborhood would inevitably hear the tale, a cautionary reminder to the board, and a small, private encouragement to the rest. Because everyone loves a story where the underdog wins, especially when it leaves the villains powerless to do anything but watch. 1.